She should eat somewhere else. Places like this aren't made for wheels. The voice cut through the diner like a blade, loud, mocking, and impossible to ignore. 3 men in patched leather vests stood near the front, laughing as one leaned over and tipped her wheelchair back just enough to send her rolling into a booth. Silverware clattered to the floor. Coffee spilled across the table. She didn't scream. She didn't even speak. But the boy by the window saw everything. So did his father. And exactly 30 minutes later, a military green SUV rolled up in front of the diner. Which city of the world are you watching from today? If these quiet warriors speak to your heart, subscribe to hear more stories that honor those who serve without seeking glory. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Dot's diner, catching dust motes that danced above the worn vinyl booths. The place had stood unchanged for 30 years, serving as Fallbrook's unofficial town hall where gossip flowed as freely as the bottomless coffee. Mercer Rayburn wheeled herself toward her usual corner spot, the one where she could keep her back to the wall and her eyes on the door-old habits that refused to die. The wheelchair moved with practiced precision under her strong arms, navigating the narrow path between tables. "Usual on," Gretchen called from behind the counter, coffee pot already in hand. The older waitress had stopped giving Mercer pitying looks about 3 weeks into her becoming a regular. Mercer nodded, her weathered face calm beneath the brim of her faded cap. "Thanks, Gretchen." Fallbrook, Montana, wasn't the kind of town where strangers lasted long without becoming either accepted or rejected. After 3 months living in the old Dawson place on the edge of town, Mercer remained somewhere in between, tolerated but still an outsider. She preferred it that way. Fewer questions about the wheelchair. Fewer questions about her past. She pulled out a small stack of Polaroid photos from her jacket pocket, handling them with careful reverence before arranging them on the table beside her mug. The images were faded now, their colors washing out from years of being touched, but the faces remained clear, young men and women in desert camouflage, arms slung around each other's shoulders, mountains rising behind them. Across the diner, 12-year-old Tatum Calloway watched Mercer over the edge of his comic book. His father, Boone, was focused on the local newspaper, strong mechanic's hands leaving faint smudges of grease on the pages, despite his best efforts to clean up before their Saturday breakfast tradition. "Dad," Tatum whispered, nudging his father, "she's got those pictures again." Boone glanced up, his eyes briefly meeting Mercer's before both looked away. He'd noticed Tooth, way she sometimes spread the photos before her like playing cards, studying them with an intensity that suggested they held more than memories. "Everyone has their ghosts, Tatum," Boone said quietly, turning the page of his newspaper. "Best to let folks tend to their own." Gretchen arrived with Mercer's order black coffee and wheat toast with 2 eggs over easy. Simple, practical food. The waitress hesitated before moving away. "Town council's talking about putting in proper sidewalk ramps next spring," she said, her voice low as if sharing a confidence. "Mentioned it might be good for tourism." Mercer's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Tourism in Fallbrook. That would be something to see. The bell above the door jangled, and the ambient chatter in the diner died. 3 men in leather vests emblazoned with Road King's patches sauntered in, filling the doorway with their presence. Lyle Switchblade Garrison led the pack, his silver-streaked beard framing a perpetual sneer. Behind him, Axel and Dodge flanked their leader like matched bulldogs. Gretchen's smile tightened as she approached them. "Seat yourselves, gentlemen. We'll take the booth by the window," Lyle declared, loud enough for everyone to hear, though there were several empty tables. It was the booth directly adjacent to where the Calloways sat. Tatum instinctively moved closer to his father as Boone's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Nobody refused the Road Kings anything in Fallbrook, not since Sheriff Pierce had decided their protection services were a necessary evil for the town. The bikers made a show of settling in, leather creaking as they sprawled across the seats. Lyle's eyes scanned the diner, pausing briefly on each face like a predator taking inventory of potential prey. "Coffee all around," he barked at Gretchen. "And tell Manny we want the special. He knows how we like it." As Gretchen hurried to the kitchen, Lyle caught sight of Mercer in her corner. His gaze lingered on her, taking in the wheelchair, the solitary breakfast, the photos arranged beside her plate. Something in his expression shifted from casual disdain to focused interest. "Well, well," he drawled, rising from his seat. "Don't think I've properly introduced myself to our newest resident." His heavy boots thudded against the linoleum as he crossed to Mercer's table. Conversations throughout the diner faltered as people suddenly became intensely interested in their food. "Lyle Garrison," he announced, not offering his hand. "These are my associates, Axel and Dodge." The other two bikers nodded from their booth, watching with amused interest. "We keep things running smooth in Fallbrook." Mercer continued eating, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She took a sip of coffee before acknowledging him with a brief nod. "Mercer, not much for conversation, are you?" Lyle leaned against the edge of her table, his bulk casting a shadow over her breakfast. "Where'd you come from, Mercer? What brings you to our little town?" "Just passing through," she replied, her voice neutral. "Liked the quiet." Lyle laughed, the sound sharp enough to make several diners flinch. "Passing through, but you bought the old Dawson place. That doesn't sound temporary to me." Mercer carefully gathered her photos, slipping them back into her pocket. "Was there something you needed?" The dismissal hung in the air, causing Axel to snicker and nudge Dodge. Lyle's face darkened momentarily, before stretching into an artificial smile. "That's not very neighborly," he said, resting his palms on her table and leaning forward. "Especially when we're the ones keeping this town safe." "Safe from what?" Mercer's voice was quiet but clear, her eyes finally meeting his with a steadiness that seemed to catch Lyle off guard. For a moment, something genuine flashed across his face, not anger, but assessment, as if recalculating the threat level presented by this stranger. The moment passed quickly, and his smile returned, sharper than before. The biker straightened, looking down at the wheelchair visible beside the table with exaggerated surprise. "Well now, didn't notice your situation there. Must be tough, getting around a town like this." His voice carried through the diner, deliberately pitched to ensure everyone heard. "She should eat somewhere else. Places like this aren't made for wheels." The diner had gone completely silent. Gretchen stood frozen by the counter, coffee pot still in hand. At the window booth, Boone's knuckles whitened around his newspaper. Tatum stared wide-eyed, his comic book forgotten beside his untouched pancakes. Mercer showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. With calm deliberation, she placed cash on the table and began to maneuver her chair backward. "Excuse me." "Now hold on," Lyle said, stepping behind her chair. "You haven't even finished your breakfast. Wouldn't want anyone thinking we're inhospitable." With a casual motion disguised as helpfulness, he tipped her wheelchair back, not hard, just enough to send her rolling uncontrolled into the side of a nearby booth. Silverware clattered to the floor. A coffee cup shattered. Mercer caught herself with strong arms, preventing a fall, but couldn't stop the contents of the table from spilling across the linoleum. "Oops," Lyle said with mock concern. "These floors are tricky." She didn't scream. She didn't even speak. Her cap had fallen forward, shadowing her eyes as she silently began picking up the scattered utensils from her position in the chair. The quiet dignity in her movements stood in stark contrast to the cruelty of the moment. The bell above the door jangled again, and Sheriff Waylon Pierce stepped in, taking in the scene with practiced indifference. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were tired, the badge on his chest polished to a shine that seemed at odds with the man wearing it. "Everything all right here?" he asked, making his way to the counter without waiting for an answer. "Just a little accident," Lyle replied, returning to his friends who were laughing openly now. "Lady can't handle her wheels." Sheriff Pierce nodded absently, accepting the cup of coffee Gretchen placed before him. He kept his eyes deliberately away from Mercer, focusing instead on the menu he surely knew by heart after 15 years as Fallbrook's sheriff. "Careful there, ma'am," he called without looking at her. "Floor can be slippery." Tatum's eyes were wide, darting between Mercer, the bikers, and his father. Something in the boy's expression shifted as he noticed a detail no one else seemed to see. When Mercer reached down to retrieve a fallen fork, her sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal part of an eagle globe, an anchor tattooed on her forearm. The boy tugged his father's sleeve and whispered urgently, pointing subtly toward Mercer's arm. Boone's expression remained neutral, but something changed in his posture, a straightening of his back, a focused alertness that hadn't been there before. He checked his watch and nodded slightly, his eyes suddenly evaluating the room with tactical precision. "We need to get to the shop," he said calmly, placing money on the table. "Got that Jensen truck coming in." As they passed Mercer, Boone paused almost imperceptibly. No words were exchanged, but something in his posture communicated a message that made Tatum glance between them with sudden understanding. Gretchen hurried over to help Mercer, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered broken ceramic pieces. "I'm so sorry about that," she whispered. "They're not usually so mean unless someone crosses them." "It's fine," Mercer replied, her voice even. "Not the first mess I've cleaned up." From their booth, the Road Kings continued watching, their laughter occasionally cutting through the now subdued conversations that had cautiously resumed. Sheriff Pierce sipped his coffee, his shoulders hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. Outside in the parking lot, Boone knelt to his son's level, his face grave but determined. "Remember that card I gave you? The one with the number?" Tatum nodded solemnly, pulling a worn business card from his wallet. It held only a phone number, no name or organization. "You said it was for real emergencies, when someone who served is being wronged." Boone looked back at the diner, his expression hardening with resolve. "I think it's time to make that call, son." "But how do you know she served?" Tatum asked, though his young face showed he already understood more than most adults might give him credit for. "The tattoo, the way she handled herself, the way she sits facing the door," Boone's voice softened, "and the way she didn't fight back when she could have. That woman in there could have taken all three of them, wheelchair or not." Tatum's fingers tightened around the card as he looked up at his father with newfound understanding. "Is that why you gave me this number? Because someday someone might do the same to you?" Boone placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because someday you might be the only one who sees what's happening to someone who can't or won't fight back. Now make the call. Tell them exactly what happened." Inside Dot's diner, Mercer had finally managed to right herself and clean up the worst of the mess. She adjusted her cap lower over her eyes and prepared to leave, only to find Lyle standing in her path once more. "Leaving so soon?" He leaned down, voice lowered to a mock whisper. "Don't you know it's rude to run out on new friends?" "We're not friends," Mercer replied evenly. "No?" Lyle reached out suddenly, knocking the cap from her head. "Maybe I know you from somewhere?" The gesture revealed Mercer's full face-strong features, framed by short-cropped hair, and a distinctive scar that ran along her hairline, from temple to ear. The mark of someone who'd gone through a windshield, or perhaps something worse. Sheriff Pierce, nursing his coffee at the counter, caught sight of the scar and froze. Something flashed across his face: recognition, then disbelief, quickly masked by deliberate indifference as he turned away. His hand trembled slightly as he set his mug down. "Don't think we've met," Mercer said, retrieving her cap from the floor and placing it back on her head with dignity. "And we won't be meeting again." This time, the Road Kings let her leave, their laughter following her out the door. Through the window, Tatum could be seen speaking urgently into a cell phone, his father's hand on his shoulder as they stood beside their truck in the parking lot. Mercer loaded herself into her own modified pickup, with practiced efficiency, sliding the wheelchair into the truck bed before pulling away. The last glimpse the diner patrons had was of her profile, stoic and straight-backed, as she drove toward the edge of town. Exactly 30 minutes later, a military green SUV rolled up in front of Dot's diner. 3 Marines stepped out, and the entire room fell silent. 30 minutes after the incident at Dot's diner, the atmosphere in Boone's auto shop was charged with quiet anticipation. The cavernous garage smelled of motor oil and metal, the radio playing classic rock at low volume, while Tatum sat on a workbench, legs swinging nervously above the concrete floor. He watched his father methodically turn a wrench on an old Ford engine, the familiar routine seeming to calm both of them. "Dad?" Tatum finally broke the silence. "Are they really coming?" Boone wiped his hands on a shop rag, leaving behind streaks of grease that would never fully wash away permanent badges of his profession. They'll come. What will they do to those men? Tatum's voice held equal parts worry and hope. The complicated emotions of a boy seeing injustice and wanting it corrected without fully understanding what that correction might entail. Boone set down his wrench and looked his son in the eye. This isn't about revenge, Tatum. Remember that. What happens next isn't revenge. It's brotherhood. The word hung in the air between them. Tatum had heard it before when his father sometimes woke shouting in the night and would sit on the porch afterward, staring at the stars. Brotherhood was sacred to Boone Calloway, even if he rarely spoke of his time in service. Is that why you gave me the card? Because she's... Tatum trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Because some bonds don't break, Boone said simply, even if we've never met her before. Tatum considered this, his young face serious beyond his years. He'd grown up learning there were things his father couldn't or wouldn't talk about, gaps in the stories of his life before Fallbrook. The card with the single phone number had been entrusted to him on his 10th birthday, with instructions that felt like a sacred oath. The man who answered, Tatum said hesitantly. He didn't seem surprised. He just asked for details and said they were already on their way. Boone nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. That would be Colonel Sutherland. Man's got ears everywhere. He's a colonel? Tatum's eyes widened. You know a colonel? New, Boone corrected gently. Long time ago, different life. He checked his watch, the old habit betraying his outward calm. They'll be here soon. Back at Dot's diner, the lunchtime crowd had thinned considerably. The Road Kings remained entrenched in their booth by the window, holding court like small-town royalty. Lyle's voice carried through the diner as he regaled his companions with exaggerated tales of past exploits, punctuated by bursts of laughter that caused the remaining patrons to flinch. Gretchen moved efficiently between tables, her professional smile never quite reaching her eyes. When she approached the biker's table with a coffee pot, Lyle grabbed her wrist. Heard the council's thinking about raising business taxes again, he said conversationally, though his grip remained firm. Shame if small places like this had to shut down. Good thing you've got our protection. We're managing, Gretchen replied, her voice carefully neutral. Coffee? Lyle released her with a smirk. Always looking out for the little guys, that's us. Sheriff Pierce had lingered at the counter long after finishing his meal, nursing a lukewarm coffee and occasionally glancing toward the door. Something about Mercer Rayburn had clearly disturbed him, though he'd made no move to follow her after she left. His radio crackled occasionally with mundane small-town business, a lost dog, a minor fender bender at the supermarket parking lot, but his attention remained distracted. When the bell above the door jangled again, Pierce's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, relaxing only when he saw it was just Barney Wilkins from the hardware store coming in for his usual lunch. The sheriff exhaled slowly, settling his bill with Gretchen. Everything quiet? She asked, her voice pitched low enough that the bikers wouldn't overhear. Always is, Pierce replied without meeting her eyes. That's why people like Fallbrook. As Pierce stepped outside into the bright Montana afternoon, he paused on the sidewalk, squinting against the sunlight. Something about seeing Mercer Rayburn's face clearly had shaken him to his core. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then dialed a number from memory. County records, he said after a moment. Need to check property transfer on the old Dawson place. New owner's name is Rayburn. First name Mercer. He listened briefly, then nodded, though no one could see him. Just the basic background, yeah. Thanks. Disconnecting, Pierce walked slowly toward his cruiser, his posture more burdened than when he'd entered the diner. Instead of heading toward the station, he turned his vehicle in the direction of the edge of town, where winding dirt roads led to the scattered outlying properties, including the old Dawson place. At precisely 11:45, aim exactly 30 minutes after the incident, the rumble of powerful engines drew attention from everyone inside Dot's diner. Through the windows, they could see a military green SUV rolling to a stop in the parking lot. It was followed by a black pickup truck and a sedan with government plates. The vehicles parked with precision, cutting off any easy exit from the lot. Inside, Lyle was holding court with his men, their laughter occasionally punctuated by the nervous clatter of Gretchen's dishes. The laughter faltered as the bell jangled, and the diner fell silent once more. Colonel Haskell Hawk Sutherland entered first, his civilian clothes doing nothing to disguise his military bearing. Though in his 50s, his posture remained ramrod straight, his eyes scanning the room with tactical efficiency. Behind him came Decker Rhodes, a mountain of a man whose prosthetic right arm gleamed dully in the diner light, and Soren Bailey, smaller but moving with coiled intensity. The Road Kings registered the newcomers with narrowed eyes, hands drifting instinctively toward concealed weapons. But something in the newcomers' coordinated movements, in the way they positioned themselves throughout the diner, made them hesitate. "Gentlemen," Colonel Sutherland addressed the room at large, though his eyes settled on Lyle. "We're looking for someone." "Tourist information's at the gas station," Lyle replied, leaning back in his booth with false bravado. Sutherland smiled thinly and approached their table. Without asking permission, he set down a folder and opened it. "Staff Sergeant Mercer Rayburn," he said, revealing a military photo of a younger Mercer in dress blues, medals displayed prominently on her chest. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. Lyle's smirk faltered as the colonel continued placing photos on the table. Mercer in combat gear, leading a squad through mountainous terrain. Mercer kneeling beside local children distributing supplies. Mercer in a hospital bed, her lower body heavily bandaged. Lost both legs, saving her entire squad when their convoy hit an IED. Sutherland continued, his voice deceptively conversational. "Dragged 3 men to safety before the secondary explosion. One of those men was from your town." The diner door opened again, and Sheriff Pierce stood frozen in the doorway, his face ashen as he stared at the gathering. Soren Bailey turned to look at him, recognition, and something harder flashing in his eyes. "Isn't that right, former Corporal Pierce?" Sutherland asked without turning around. The sheriff's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Every eye in the diner turned to him, including those of Boone and Tatum Calloway, who had slipped in behind him. "She," Pierce began, his voice cracking. "She never said who she was." "She never does," Decker spoke up, his deep voice resonating through the silent diner. "Mercer doesn't believe in using her service for special treatment. But we," Sutherland continued, gathering the photos with deliberate precision, "believe in honoring those who served, especially those who sacrificed everything for their brothers and sisters in arms." Lyle's face had drained of color, but he attempted to rally. "Look, we didn't know." "That's the problem with people like you," Decker cut him off, his massive frame now looming over their table. "You never bother to know who you're stepping on." Sheriff Pierce took a faltering step into the diner, suddenly looking much older than his 50-odd years. The weight of recognition and shame seemed to physically bend his shoulders. "I knew it was her," he admitted, the words hanging in the silent diner. "Recognized her 3 months ago when she moved to town. Thought maybe she didn't remember me." "She remembered," Soren Bailey said quietly. "She remembers everything." The revelation hung in the air as the diner patrons began to understand the full implications. Pierce hadn't just failed to protect Mercer, had actively betrayed the woman who had saved his life. "She pulled you from the burning Humvee," Decker stated. Not as a question, but as fact. "Went back in even as the fire spread toward the ammunition." Pierce nodded, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "The explosion took her legs seconds after she dragged me clear." Lyle shifted uncomfortably, his 2 companions looking increasingly eager to be elsewhere. But Sutherland and his men had positioned themselves with military precision. No one was leaving until this was finished. "We're not here for violence," Decker said, addressing the Road Kings directly. "We're here because when you disrespect one Marine, you disrespect all of us, and that doesn't stand." From the diner's kitchen doorway, Gretchen cleared her throat. "She's been coming in here 3 times a week. Quiet, polite, always leaves a 20% tip. Never once mentioned being a hero." "She wouldn't," Soren said with a hint of sad pride. "That's Mercer." Colonel Sutherland closed the folder and fixed Lyle with a steady gaze. "I suggest you and your associates reconsider your business practices in Fallbrook. We'll be staying a while to help our friend adjust to her new home." "And what if we don't take suggestions well?" Lyle challenged. though the bravado in his voice had thinned considerably. Sutherland smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Then you'll discover that we didn't just come here out of brotherhood. We came with evidence. He nodded toward Soren, who produced a USB drive. Tax evasion, extortion, assault. 3 federal agencies are very interested in the Road King's activities across state lines. The color drained from Lyle's face as he realized the trap he'd walked into. This wasn't just about today's harassment somehow. These men had been building a case. This can go one of 2 ways. Sutherland continued. You can pack up and leave Fallbrook tonight, never to return. Or we can make a call, and those federal agencies will be very interested in speaking with you immediately. You can't just come into our town and dictate terms, Lyle sputtered, but the defiance rang hollow. Your town? Boone spoke up from where he stood with Tatum. This town belongs to the people who build it up, not those who tear it down. Tatum looked up at his father with undisguised admiration, understanding for the first time why the card with the single number had been entrusted to him as such a solemn responsibility. As the standoff continued inside, a modified pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. Mercer Rayburn sat behind the wheel for a long moment, taking in the familiar vehicles parked outside the diner. Her expressions cycled through surprise, exasperation, and finally, a reluctant affection. The bell above the door jangled once more as she wheeled herself in, taking in the tableau before her with a single glance. Her former squad, the Road Kings, Sheriff Pierce's badge on the table. The silent, watching townspeople. I told you not to come, she said simply to Sutherland. The colonel shrugged. You've never been very good at giving orders, Sarge. For the first time since she'd arrived in Fallbrook, Mercer Rayburn smiled, a small, crooked thing, but genuine. The Brotherhood arrives, whether you want them or not, Decker added with a grin that transformed his intimidating face. Mercer's eyes landed on Pierce, and something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. So, she said, wheeling herself forward, I'm guessing everyone knows now. They know you're a hero. Tatum spoke up suddenly from beside his father, earning a surprised look from the adults. Mercer shook her head. No heroes here, kid. Just people doing their jobs. She looked around at her former squad members, some better than others. We've negotiated new terms with the local businessmen, Sutherland informed her with the faintest hint of amusement. They're reconsidering their presence in Fallbrook. And I'm reconsidering my career in law enforcement, Pierce added quietly. Gretchen stepped forward, coffee pot in hand, offering it to Mercer like a peace offering. Your breakfast got interrupted. Second tries on the house. As the tension in the diner gradually dissipated, the Road King slipped out, Lyle's face a mask of controlled fury. But the damage was done. The town had witnessed their humiliation and the exposure of their protection racket. Mercer accepted the coffee and looked around at her squad. Her brother Snow gathered around her table. You're all staying, aren't you? She asked resignedly. Just until we're sure you're settled, Sutherland replied, though his tone suggested a longer visit. The Dawson place has plenty of room, she conceded with a sigh that couldn't quite hide her relief. Boone approached their table, Tatum at his side. Staff Sergeant, he said, offering a respectful nod. Corporal Boone Calloway, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Different time, different war, but still family. But always a Marine, Mercer finished, extending her hand. Figured you might be, the way you carry yourself. As hands clasped in recognition, the last of the barriers fell, not just between Mercer and Boone, but between Mercer and Fallbrook itself. Outside, the Montana sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as afternoon faded toward evening. Inside Dot's diner, a different kind of warmth prevailed, the warmth of brotherhood extended, of community restored, of quiet warriors finally finding home. 1 week later, Dot's diner sported a newly installed ramp at its entrance, the smooth wooden incline replacing the single concrete step that had stood as an unintentional barrier for decades. The morning light caught the fresh coat of varnish, making it gleam like amber against the weathered exterior of the building. Inside, the corner booth had been modified to accommodate wheelchairs, the table raised slightly and one bench removed. Mercer Rayburn sat there now, surrounded by her squad as they shared breakfast and stories. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely from the tension-filled encounter a week prior. Where silence and fear had once reigned, laughter and conversation now flowed freely. "So, there's Decker," Colonel Sutherland was saying, gesturing with a fork laden with scrambled eggs, 250 pounds of prime marine, stuck halfway through a window because he misjudged the opening. "It was a narrow window," Decker protested good-naturedly, his massive frame dwarfing the coffee mug in his hand. The prosthetic arm glinted in the morning light, now openly displayed rather than hidden, "and I got through eventually." "Yeah, after Mercer kicked you in the backside and sent you tumbling headfirst into the compound," Soren Bailey added with a grin. The smallest of the squad, his wiry frame and quiet demeanor masked the sharp tactical mind that had made him their reconnaissance specialist. "I maintain it was a strategic push," Mercer corrected, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The past week had softened something in her, allowing glimpses of the woman she had been before injury had changed her path. Gretchen approached with a fresh pot of coffee, her manner transformed from the nervous servility she'd shown the Road Kings to genuine warmth. "More coffee, folks?" "Please." Sutherland held out his mug. "Best coffee this side of Kandahar." "That's not saying much," Mercer muttered, earning laughs from her squad. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of Boone and Tatum Calloway. The boy spotted Mercer's table immediately and made a beeline for them, his father following at a more measured pace. "Morning, Staff Sergeant." Tatum greeted with the formal address he'd insisted on using, despite Mercer's attempts to get him to use her first name. "Morning, Private Calloway." She returned with equal formality, their established routine bringing a smile to both their faces. Boone nodded to the assembled veterans. "Mind if we join you?" "Pull up a chair." Sutherland welcomed them, shifting to make room. Over the past week, Boone had gradually revealed his own service history to the group, the shared experiences bridging decades of different conflicts and experiences. As Gretchen took their orders, the door opened again, and former Sheriff Waylon Pierce entered. He'd surrendered his badge the day after the confrontation at the diner, the weight of his betrayal too heavy to bear once exposed to the light of day. Now he wore civilian clothes, the absence of his uniform making him look somehow smaller, but also less burdened. The conversation at the table dimmed as he approached, uncertainty hanging in the air. Pierce stopped a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was hoping I might have a word." Sutherland looked to Mercer, deferring to her judgment. She studied Pierce for a long moment before nodding toward an empty chair. "Join us," she said simply. Pierce sat awkwardly, placing his hat on the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week." "About time," Decker muttered, earning a quelling look from Sutherland. "I've got no excuse," Pierce continued, addressing Mercer directly. "I recognized you the day you came to town. I knew what you'd done for me, for all of us, and I was too much of a coward to acknowledge it." "Why?" Mercer asked, the single word carrying the weight of years of silence. Pierce's gaze dropped to the table. "Because every time I looked at you, I saw what my survival cost. I couldn't face that, couldn't face you." The table fell silent, the surrounding diner noise suddenly seeming distant and irrelevant. This was a moment between warriors, a reckoning long overdue. "I never blamed you," Mercer said at last. "Not for my legs, not for surviving. That was my job, getting you all out." "But I blame myself," Pierce admitted. "Still do. And then I came back here, and instead of honoring what you gave up, I let men like Garrison run roughshod over the town. Told myself it was pragmatic, that it kept the peace." "Peace through subjugation isn't peace," Soren observed quietly. Pierce nodded in acknowledgement. "I know that now. I should have known it then." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "I've been in touch with the state police. Everything I know about the Road King's operation is in here. Plus, records of my own failings. They're sending someone to take my statement officially this afternoon." Sutherland took the envelope, his expression grave. "This is a start." "It's all I can offer," Pierce said. "That, and an apology that's years too late." He turned to Mercer. I'm sorry. For everything. Mercer studied her former comrade, seeing beyond the civilian clothes to the young corporal who had once followed her through the mountains of Afghanistan. We all carry weight, Pierce. Some of us just carry it differently. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was an acknowledgement that opened a path forward. Pierce nodded in understanding, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. There's something else, he said, straightening slightly. The county's looking for someone to run the Veterans Services Office. It's been understaffed for years. I mentioned your name. Mercer raised an eyebrow. I'm not much for paperwork. It's not just paperwork, Pierce countered. It's helping people navigate the system, making sure they get what they've earned. Who better than someone who knows firsthand what they're going through? Before Mercer could respond, the diner door opened again, this time admitting a group of elderly patrons. Among them was Walter Finch, known locally as Old Walt, who had served in Vietnam and rarely left his home at the edge of town. Today, however, he made his way up the new ramp with the aid of a walker, his wife Beverly supporting his other arm. Would you look at that? Beverly exclaimed as they entered. Finally, a place Walter can get into without a production. We've been waiting 40 years for this town to remember. Not everyone can climb steps. Walt nodded in agreement, his weathered face showing relief at the simple accommodation. Spotting Mercer and her squad, he offered a crisp nod of recognition, one veteran to another. Gretchen bustled over to assist the newcomers, showing them to another modified table that had been installed near the back. We're making changes, she told them proudly. About time, too. Mercer watched the interaction thoughtfully, then turned back to Pierce. I'll think about it. The Veterans Office. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a state police cruiser outside. Through the window, they could see two officers exiting the vehicle, their expressions serious as they surveyed the diner. That'll be about my statement, Pierce said, rising from the table. And probably about the Road Kings, too. Speaking of, Soren commented, anyone seen them this past week? Boone shook his head. Word is they cleared out their clubhouse 2 nights ago. Left in a hurry. Smart move, Decker noted with satisfaction, especially since our evidence was forwarded to several agencies. As Pierce moved to meet the state police officers outside, Tatum leaned forward eagerly. Did you really chase them out of town? Sutherland smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. We didn't have to. Once people stop fearing bullies, bullies lose their power. It wasn't just us, Mercer added, nodding toward where Boone sat. Your dad made some calls too, got the business owners to stand together. Boone shrugged modestly. Once people knew they weren't alone, it was easier to find courage. Outside, the meeting with the state police appeared to be proceeding formally but peacefully. Pierce's shoulders remained straight as he spoke, occasionally gesturing toward the diner where Mercer sat. They'll be interviewing all of us, Sutherland predicted, watching through the window, building a case not just against the Road Kings but against the system that allowed them to flourish. Will it make a difference? Tatum asked, the question carrying the weight of a child's unvarnished hope for justice. It already has, Mercer answered, gesturing around the transformed diner, at the veterans now able to enter freely, at the townspeople greeting each other with renewed openness. This is what change looks like. Small steps that add up. After breakfast, the group made their way outside. The morning had warmed considerably, the Montana summer asserting itself with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Across the street, several storefronts showed signs of renovation. The hardware store was installing its own ramp, and the bookshop next door had a veterans discount sign freshly painted in the window. Town's waking up, Decker observed as they paused on the sidewalk. About time, Soren agreed. Mercer looked around at the changes, both physical and intangible, that had swept through Fallbrook in just 1 week. I wasn't looking for this, she admitted quietly to Sutherland as the others moved ahead. Wasn't looking to stir things up. Some people change the world just by being in it, Sutherland replied, whether they mean to or not. At the town square, a small crowd had gathered around a newly cleared patch of ground. Mayor Jenkins, who had been conspicuously absent during the confrontation at the diner, now stood before a modest sign announcing the future site of the Fallbrook Veterans Memorial. Thought that was just talk, Mercer commented skeptically. Oh, it was, Sutherland confirmed, with a knowing smile. Until Decker had a little chat with the mayor about civic responsibility. And until Soren happened to mention those interesting financial records he found while investigating the Road Kings, Boone added, having overheard. Turns out the mayor had some explaining to do about certain tax allocations. Mercer shook her head, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. You three haven't changed, still fighting other people's battles. Only the ones worth fighting, Sutherland corrected. And only for those who deserve it. Mayor Jenkins spotted their group and hurried over, his politician's smile firmly in place. Staff Sergeant Rayburn, so glad you could join us today. We're hoping you might say a few words at the groundbreaking ceremony. Mercer's expression closed immediately. I don't do speeches. Of course. The mayor backpedaled quickly. Perhaps Colonel Sutherland then. I think, Sutherland said deliberately, this memorial should be dedicated by someone from Fallbrook, someone who knows the community and what service means to it. He glanced meaningfully at Boone. The mechanic looked startled. Me? I'm no public speaker. You're a Marine who came home and built a life here, Sutherland countered. That's exactly what this memorial is about. Before Boone could protest further, Tatum spoke up. Do it, Dad. You always tell me we should stand up for what matters. The simple faith in his son's eyes settled the matter. Boone nodded, squeezing Tatum's shoulder. All right then. The impromptu ceremony was brief but powerful. Boone spoke, without pretense, about service and sacrifice, about the visible and invisible wounds veterans carried, and about the responsibility of communities to remember and support those who had served. As he spoke, Mercer noticed several attendees wearing small pins that simply read, I served people she'd passed in town for months without knowing they shared that bond. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, a weathered man in his 70s approached Mercer. He wore one of the pins, and his eyes held the unmistakable look of someone who had seen combat. Frank Hollister, he introduced himself. Korea, just wanted to say thanks, not just for your service, but for being the spark this town needed. Mercer accepted his offered hand, recognizing a kindred spirit. Wasn't trying to spark anything. Sometimes we make the biggest difference when we're not trying, Frank replied with a knowing nod. Heard Pierce mentioned you for the VA office job. You'd be good at it. Still thinking about it, Mercer admitted. Well, think hard, Frank urged. There's about 24 of us old war horses in this town who could use someone who understands the system, someone who won't give up when the paperwork gets tough. As Frank moved away, Sutherland rejoined Mercer. He's right, you know. You've always been good at fighting through bureaucratic barriers. Is that what this week has been about? Mercer asked, suddenly suspicious. Setting me up with a purpose? Sutherland raised his hands in mock surrender. We came because a child called and said one of our own was being harassed. Everything else just fell into place. Mercer's gaze drifted to where Tatum stood with his father, the boy's expression bright with pride as townspeople congratulated Boone on his speech. The kid's got good instincts. Gets it from his father, Sutherland agreed. Speaking of, Boone tells me you've been helping Tatum with his science project. Something about wheelchair mechanics? A smile ghosted across Mercer's face. Kid's curious about how things work. Reminds me of someone else I knew back in the day. You, Sutherland observed, are putting down roots. Never thought I'd see the day. Don't get ahead of yourself, Colonel, Mercer cautioned, though without heat. I'm just passing through, remember? Of course, Sutherland agreed with diplomatic gravity, though his eyes twinkled with knowing amusement. Just passing through. As the gathering concluded, they made their way back toward Dot's diner, where their vehicles were parked. Soren fell into step beside Mercer, his quiet presence a familiar comfort. You know we'll have to head out soon, he said, watching her closely. Decker's got that consulting job waiting, and the colonel has his classes to teach. I know, Mercer acknowledged. You've all got lives to get back to. So do you, Soren pointed out gently. Maybe it's starting right here. Before Mercer could respond, they spotted a familiar truck parked across from the diner Lyle Garrison's black pickup. The Road King's leader was loading the last of his possessions into the bed, his movements angry and jerky. When he spotted Mercer and her group, He froze momentarily, hatred flashing across his face. Decker moved protectively closer to Mercer, but she waved him off. "Let him go," she said calmly. "He's already lost everything that mattered to him." They watched as Lyle slammed the truck's tailgate closed and climbed into the cab. The engine roared to life, unnecessarily loud in the quiet street, and the truck peeled away, leaving a cloud of dust and the acrid smell of burning rubber. "Think he'll be back?" Boone asked, joining them with Tatum at his side. "Not if he's smart," Sutherland assessed. "But if he does, I suspect he'll find this isn't the same town he left." That evening, as sunset painted the Montana sky in breathtaking shades of orange and purple, Mercer sat on the porch of the old Dawson place. The house had begun to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home, with small changes accumulating day by day: a new ramp to replace the broken steps, freshly planted flowers along the walkway, courtesy of Beverly Finch, curtains in the windows that Gretchen had insisted on hanging to make the place civilized. Her squad joined her on the porch, each carrying a drink as they settled into the comfortable silence of people who had seen both the best and worst of each other. No words were needed as they watched the sun sink below the distant mountains, painting the landscape in gold. A truck approached along the dirt road, raising a small cloud of dust. Boone's familiar vehicle pulled up, and he and Tatum climbed out, carrying what appeared to be a freshly baked pie. "Beverly sent this over," Boone explained as they climbed the porch steps. "Says it's payment for agreeing to talk to her garden club next week about accessible gardening techniques." Mercer accepted the pie with a raised eyebrow. "I don't recall agreeing to that." "Must have slipped your mind," Sutherland suggested innocently. "Senior moment, perhaps." The gentle teasing broke the evening solemnity, bringing laughter that echoed across the property. As they shared the pie and conversation flowed easily, Tatum approached Mercer with a small, wrapped package. "Made this for you," he said, suddenly shy. "In shop class." Mercer unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal a hand-carved wooden plaque. Burned into the wood in careful letters were the words, "Home of Staff Sergeant Mercer Rayburn, USMC." "Figured you might want to make it official," Tatum explained, watching her face anxiously. "Since you're staying and all." Mercer ran her fingers over the carved letters, something tight and warm expanding in her chest. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you, Tatum." As the boy beamed under her approval, Mercer caught Boone's eye over his son's head. The mechanic nodded in understanding, a silent acknowledgement of what the gesture truly meant: acceptance, belonging, home. Later, as Boone and Tatum prepared to leave, Mercer wheeled herself to the edge of the porch. "That veteran's office job," she called after them. "Who would I talk to about applying?" Boone smiled, the expression lighting his weathered face. "I'll bring the paperwork by tomorrow." As their truck disappeared down the drive, Mercer turned to find her squad, watching her with varying expressions of satisfaction. "What?" she demanded, though without heat. "Nothing, Sarge," Decker replied innocently. "Just glad to see you finding your place." "This wasn't the plan," she admitted, wheeling herself back to join them. "Plans change," Sutherland said simply. "That's what makes life interesting." "Speaking of plans," Soren interjected, "we should probably head out day after tomorrow. Give you some space to settle in properly." Mercer nodded, surprised by the pang of loss she felt at the thought of their departure. "You know, you're welcome anytime." "We know," Sutherland confirmed. "And Mercer, we're proud of you. Always have been." Under the vast Montana sky, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening twilight, Mercer Rayburn felt something long knotted within her begin to unfurl. Not healing, exactly, some wounds never fully healed, but something like peace, like purpose, like belonging. The old Dawson place wasn't just a house anymore. Fowlbrook wasn't just a town she was passing through. And the people gathered around her weren't just former comrades or new acquaintances. They were home. They were community. They were family. And that, Mercer realized as she looked at Tatum's gift once more, was worth fighting for.